For those of you who are unfortunate enough to be exposed to mainstream punditry, you're probably aware that one of the most common talking points against Bernie Sanders as a viable candidate is that he is the new George McGovern, and that if we nominate Bernie, it will be 1972 all over again. McGovern's name has been raised many times since 1972, especially from the 80s forward, and it is always by a group of people urging the Democrats to move to the right and trying to say that the left is unelectable. In fact, by the 80s, this had become one of the foundational myths of neoliberalism, the idea being that the age of big government ended in failure, and the only way forward to a viable future for the Democratic Party lay in moving to the right. In this video, what I want to do is dismantle the McGovern myth by showing in detail how there are key differences between McGovern's race and between what Bernie Sanders is doing now, and also just to do a reality check on what actually happened in 1972 and what the circumstances were which led to McGovern's defeat. This comparison between Bernie Sanders and George McGovern is a favorite talking point, especially of older analysts like Chris Matthews on MSNBC and James Carville, who helped Bill Clinton win the White House back in 1992. They are often of the opinion that Democrats have to run to the center in order to win, and that's their only option. And both of them are old enough to remember 1972, so they always speak about it as if they have something authoritative to say about it. The fact of the matter is, however, that they're greatly distorting it, or else they simply didn't understand it because they had a snapshot impression back at the time and they haven't thought about it since. I tend to think in the case of Chris Matthews, it is simply a matter of him not understanding. He doesn't really seem like a liar, but he is kind of on the dumb side, to put it unkindly but accurately. James Carville, however, I think is clever enough that he really is just manufacturing a fake understanding of what happened in 1972. As I mentioned, the neoliberal myth about 1972 is one of the key examples that they always bring up and use to bash their opponents. This is one of their justifications for abandoning unions and economic populism and embracing big business and the professional class as wholeheartedly as they have. As we'll see, there's also been a big shift in the way that the McGovern myth is translated to the present based around the use of identity politics. And that transitional phase is right at 2008 for reasons we'll get into, but you can probably already guess. Another thing I'd like to point out is that there are some problems when comparing Bernie with McGovern. I categorize this on the screen as McGovern's opportunism. McGovern was not as principled as Bernie Sanders, despite being one of the more principled men of his day. But also there are differences in the way that Bernie and McGovern organized and presented themselves, and those things have to be taken into account if we're talking about both viability and how they might govern, etc. One of the other talking points that has been used to bash McGovern over and over and over the years, and all the people who are compared to him, is by saying that his McGovern coalition was inherently unviable and that it was a coalition of people who had no chance to win. As I will demonstrate, the McGovern coalition actually set out a blueprint about 40 years in advance of what the Democratic Party, pretty much the entire Democratic Party, does today. And finally, as a historian, I can't help but think that context is king. So what we'll do is also consider the context of 1972 versus 2020, and we'll see that comparing these two political contexts as if they're interchangeable is at best idiotic and at worst a complete and total lie. So let's get started by looking at the myth itself. Neoliberal mythology begins in 1968, but because that's a year that's often studied, there's so many books written about it, and all of the boomers and silent generation people who lived through it remember it very vividly. However, 1972 is much easier to forget. It was quickly overshadowed by Watergate after the fact, and it just doesn't compare with 1968 in terms of all the drama. So it is a perfect year to mythologize because people don't really pay that much attention to it. And for younger voters, they don't remember it because they weren't alive. For older voters, it's not something worth looking back on because it either brings up bad memories in a vague sense. This was the candidate of their youth who ultimately failed and lost to Nixon, the guy who quickly then became one of the great villains of American history. So 1972 is actually a very clever election to try to obscure and then present as something that it simply wasn't. One of the core assumptions of the myth, which is probably the most incorrect of them all, is that McGovern had a really good chance of defeating Nixon if only he had just run to the center and not been such a flaming lib. By embracing the anti-war movement and social radicals, McGovern effectively turned off all the blue-collar voters and then forced them to side with Nixon. Now, as we'll discuss, that is not exactly how the anti-war movement worked, and there is no truth to the claim that blue-collar workers were in solidarity behind the Vietnam War. In fact, it's the opposite. The more income you had, the less likely your children were to be drafted into the war, therefore the higher your support for the war. So this part of the myth is also completely untrue and was disproven by contemporary polls. Another part of the myth is that big government policies were no longer popular or feasible, and people were tired of them. We'll look at what Nixon did as president. He won re-election quite handily in 1972, so apparently that is something that is quite a stretch. And another part of the reason why McGovern lost is because he employed economic populism. He demonized the rich. And this was at a time when people just wanted some economic growth, and McGovern also employed some identity politics at a time when people just wanted law and order. And if he had just given them what they wanted, then he would have won surely over the despicable, bejowled Richard Nixon. But, as we'll show again, economic populism has proven to be really damn effective time and time again, and in almost every known context in American politics. So, what was the actual context of the 1972 presidential election? Despite what we now think of Nixon in light of him leaving office in disgrace, in 1972, and both a little before that and a little after, Nixon maintained a pretty high approval rating. This is despite the Vietnam War continuing and being extremely unpopular. Nixon was a savvy politician with few ideological commitments. His main interest was in foreign policy, so he did what he needed to do to maintain his popularity on the domestic front. And if that meant adopting some of the policies of the left that were popular, he would do that. He spent quite a bit of money on the humanities and various endowments. He created the EPA. He did all kinds of things to keep the left satisfied. Now, sure, there were people who absolutely hated his guts, whether they were partisan Democrats or anti-war activists or whatever, but for the most part, Nixon did a good job of creating some support from a good, solid number of Democrats. Possibly the most important factor is that the economy under Nixon saw both job and wage growth. This is important to point out. A lot of people, when they think of the 70s, the sort of general characterization is that it was a time of stagnation and that the country was depressed, there was a gas crisis, etc. But the early 70s were different. And even in the mid to late 70s, when the overall economy wasn't great, wages were still keeping pace with inflation right up until the end of the decade. So this was still a time you could go and get a job at a factory just out of high school. As long as you were willing to show up 8 hours a day, you could make a good living, and you had every reason to expect that your standard of living would increase over time and that your children would have a higher standard of living than you enjoyed. So everything seemed fine at the time. Nixon was not a pariah yet. Nixon was also, while still conducting Vietnam, bombing Cambodia, and doing some other shady shit, overall, if you look at the general direction of his policy, he was downsizing American commitment in Vietnam and also simultaneously cooling off Cold War tensions. Remember the famous flight to China. The public did not want war, whether in Vietnam or a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union. So Nixon's policies there were seen as successful and moving in the right direction. So here's the reality. No Democrat was going to win in 1972. One article I saw on this subject said that if the Democrats could have resurrected FDR, even he would not have won this election. And I think that they're not entirely wrong there. If a president seems to be successful almost across the board, a lot of people who might even be Democrats or Democrat-leaning independents are going to be willing to give this person a chance, especially since he continued most of the major policies that his predecessors had put in place that were popular with left-leaning people. Nixon did not end the war on poverty, for instance. Johnson's programs continued under Nixon. They didn't grow, but they continued to work their effects, and they continued throughout the rest of the 70s. By the time that Reagan eventually axed the war on poverty, it actually had reduced poverty by a little bit. Now you could say, yeah, if Nixon had expanded these programs, maybe the effect would have been more dramatic, but the fact is that Nixon realized these were popular and that they were having some effect. He left them in place. People couldn't really complain about that. No one expected Republicans to go and expand the welfare state. However, the neoliberal version is that McGovern's leftist commitments were what lost the election. But again, if you have a president with about a 60% approval rating, and most people approve of what he's doing on almost every issue, how in the hell do you beat this guy? You don't. That's how you do it. Let's compare this with 2008. Does anyone honestly believe that any other Republican would have done better than John McCain? The only real mistake McCain made was choosing Sarah Palin. Aside from that, he pretty much did his absolute best to minimize the damage of the Bush years. Had he picked someone more competent than Palin, he might have been able to hang on to Indiana. That would have been really the only difference in that election. That was a foregone conclusion. 1972 was even more of a foregone conclusion because you had a very powerful and popular incumbent who was almost assured re-election barring assassination or a heart attack or something like that. It had to be a fatal heart attack as we now understand. So let's look at how George McGovern got through the 1972 primary in order to win the nomination. McGovern's campaign was effectively a combination of populist economic messaging, talking about the need for the wealthy to pay their fair share of taxes, talking about how income inequality is a problem, how the wealthy are overly influential in our politics, combining that with appeals to marginalized identities. He was pretty much the first candidate to openly appeal to the gay community, for instance. He also appealed to the African American community, which had recently won civil rights, but was largely being neglected after that and for some time going forward. So basically, McGovern tried to bring together the people who were marginalized in the Democratic Party and build a coalition of those people and then win with it. He also had a lot of college student support, and this became the way that he was smeared. Other party leaders would say that McGovern's support was all a bunch of entitled college kids. He was ferociously opposed from the outset by almost all of the party's leaders, and we'll talk about he did create one of these feuds himself, but for the most part this was organized by the people who were influential in the party who did not want to go McGovern's direction. They were especially afraid of going left on social issues. Eventually, his policies were smeared as being acid, amnesty, and abortion. The implication being that he was pro-drug, that he wanted to pardon all the people who had not shown up for the draft for Vietnam, and that he was in favor of abortion at a time when abortion was still a 50-50 issue. So basically they were just trying to paint him as a free love hippie type, which is strange considering that George McGovern was a World War II hero and one of the best known veterans of the war. He flew a B-24 and distinguished himself on many occasions. So painting him as a hippie is fucking crazy. One of the chief architects of the anti-McGovern campaign, ironically, was George Meany, the leader of the AFL-CIO. McGovern, as we'll see, had a somewhat shaky voting record, but when it came to labor issues, his voting record was a solid 95%. Yet George Meany did not like McGovern and feared his left-leaning on social issues, so refused to allow his organization to endorse McGovern. The organization itself, the membership, wanted to endorse McGovern, but Meany said no. And yes, it's sort of a side issue, but Meany was a real asshole, and despite being the leader of the AFL-CIO, he did a lot to undermine organized labor over the course of his career. Different story for a different day, But George Meany's name basically tells you most of what you need to know about him in just a single word. After a bruising primary fight, and don't worry, we'll go through a few more of the details in a minute, McGovern then went on to lose the general election and lose it extremely badly. So again, the neoliberals took the sheer fact of McGovern's defeat, ignored all of the actual context, the strength of Nixon, the screw job they pulled on him in the primaries, the fact that the acid amnesty and abortion line then basically became Nixon's attack after being invented by none other than McGovern's first running mate, Eagleton. They ignored all of that and just pinned all the blame on McGovern and his lefty supporters. They tried to make it out like it was just the fault of this group of people, and they themselves bore no blame whatsoever. The context of Nixon having a 60% approval rating, irrelevant. The reason, again, they were able to do this is because short-lived political memory means that it's very easy to rewrite the recent past if the recent past is something that's not all that well remembered or talked about on a frequent basis. Neoliberals have been trying to rewrite 2016, but it's not working because we all remember it and it was a new 1968-esque year. It's something that no one who lived through it will ever forget. However, if they wanted to distort 2012 or 2004, which, by the way, is another one they've distorted, guess what? Those are easy to distort because not many people talk about those. Those aren't considered memorable elections. Another example, like 1996, they could make up a lot of bullshit about that and no one would be the wiser, most likely, even people who lived through it. Again, neoliberals were starting to emerge in the 1970s. They hadn't quite taken mature form, and there are variations among them as they really emerge into power in the 80s and 90s. But the basic idea of them in the 70s is that they realized that at this time big business was able to spend more money than unions. The influence and power of big business was increasing while unions were stagnant and then starting to decline. Not only that, but a few Supreme Court cases, I think there are 3 of them across the course of the 70s, basically opened up elections to unlimited corporate cash. This was still pre-Citizens United, but all Citizens United is basically steroids for an existing problem that was created in the 1970s. So these Democrats realized that they needed to go where the money was. So they were thinking, let's abandon unions and the working class who can only give us so much money and embrace the professional class and the people who are corporate bigwigs. They can give us more money. We'll need money to win. And part of that is creating a myth that if you go populist left, if you talk about labor, if you work for the working class, you will be unelectable. And the left as a whole, whether the social or the economic left, is just simply unviable as a center-right country because 1972. That's all the proof you need. Just ignore what Nixon did. Ignore everything else. It has to be a center-right country because 1972. Look at the map. Ironically, there are a couple of fables that the neoliberals like to promote, except when it comes to their people. Party unity is something they talk about ad nauseum because they assume that the left will have to meet them halfway and vote for the neoliberal candidate. However, when it looks like an actual progressive is going to win, the party throws a fucking fit. They also say vote blue no matter who, although they rarely do that if it is a progressive in question. Yet, if they were going to have any chance against Nixon at all, and in this case it just means staunching the bleeding a little bit, winning more than one state, that's what they should have done and rallied behind McGovern. Maybe then they would have won 3 states rather than just 1. But they didn't. So if you're really looking to learn an actual lesson, the lesson is that the ideas of party unity and vote blue no matter who are self-serving neoliberal myths. These are their talking points that they only follow right up until the point when someone they don't like is slated to win. Iowa, right now, it looks like Bernie Sanders has it in the bag, and now Pete Buttigieg is calling in the DNC to try to invalidate the results of the satellite caucuses so that he can win even though he did not win the popular vote either. So this whole thing is a sham. While I am firmly of the opinion that George McGovern had absolutely no chance regardless of what he did, there are mistakes that he made that are worth pointing out, which may have hurt his turnout and his eventual vote total. One of the things McGovern did early on was to make a deadly enemy of Washington Senator Scoop Jackson by calling him a racist. McGovern was one of the stronger senators on civil rights, so this was one of his pet issues, and Scoop Jackson was not that strong on the issue, but it was a period by which calling someone a racist was very much a character attack, and it really did not reflect well on the person being called a racist. So understandably, Scoop Jackson was extremely pissed off, and that led him to organize the Anybody But McGovern movement within the party, which is sort of like the Stop Bernie movement that is going on right now. The idea here is that they will back literally anyone who can beat McGovern, and they will say anything that is harmful for McGovern. Now, McGovern still managed to win the primary because none of his opponents were able to consolidate behind a single opponent, and this means that he ended up winning. One of the minor candidates of that year was the first ever female candidate, actually a black woman, Shirley Chisholm. And after her campaign flamed out, I believe she was basically a favorite daughter from New York. It wasn't all that serious of a campaign. Gloria Steinem, one of her chief organizers, joined the McGovern team. And while McGovern was trying to put together a coalition of the disaffected, apparently he did not do all that much to win the favor of people like Steinem. And once she was in the campaign, she felt neglected. This is something she's talked about in the years since. So McGovern potentially could have done more to make sure that all the members of his coalition felt more welcome and that they felt that their voices mattered more. So that was kind of a mistake as well. Another huge mistake that he made is that he chose Tom Eagleton to be his vice president without a thorough vetting process, one, but also without knowing he picked the guy who was the actual person who dubbed the AAA attack of acid amnesty abortion. He didn't find this out until later, after Eagleton had left the ticket. And then McGovern made a second mistake in regard to Eagleton. So he asked Eagleton if it was true that he had ever had any mental health issues in the past. Eagleton said no, which was a lie. Then it came out that Eagleton, who had suffered from depression, had undergone electroshock therapy to cure it. You have to remember, this is not 2020. In 1972, any mental illness, even something that is treatable and you can live with pretty easily, like depression, was something that was seen as a non-starter for a leader. So this was devastating to the credibility of Eagleton, and McGovern then decided to drop him from the ticket. Now, had McGovern campaigned in a different way, if he was just a hard-nosed, sort of center-right candidate, no one would have thought anything of it. But because he is campaigning as a social crusader, this was seen as insensitive and cruel. It was also seen as incompetent because he hadn't properly vetted Eagleton, and then it came out not only that Eagleton had lied to him to get on the ticket, but also had come up with the acid amnesty abortion line. And I guess it was even further proof in the minds of people at the time that Eagleton must have been mentally unstable, because even after saying he hates McGovern and everything he stands for, he jumped on the ticket. So complete and total shit show with the vice presidential pick. The only person that McGovern was then able to find to fill out the ticket was Sergeant Shriver, and whether that was a good pick or not is hard to say. However, clearly it didn't help much, and by this point there was so much damage done that it didn't really matter who McGovern picked. No one trusted his judgment on picking a VP. Another major mistake that McGovern made is that his candidacy was fundamentally predicated on being the anti-war guy. The anti-war movement trusted him because he had been speaking out against Vietnam since almost the very beginning, and he had done so very consistently. However, as he got into the general, for whatever reason, he pivoted to the center on the issue of the war. He should have known this was a mistake because back in 1968, Hubert Humphrey had run as a pro-war candidate, and he had been losing by leaps and bounds to Nixon. In the last several weeks, he then said, you know what, actually, I'm against the war. And then he tightened up the race. Had he done that a few weeks earlier, Humphrey may very well have won the 1968 election, and then there was never a President Nixon. But he didn't have the wisdom to do that. McGovern, who was an anti-war guy for years, apparently thought he had to pivot to the center in spite of evidence to the contrary and a growing sense of the war being unpopular across the country and with a very broad swath of voters. Another thing he did was give in to the right-wing talking point that North Vietnam was holding a bunch of POWs secretly, and he said that he would maintain a small force in the region until these POWs were returned. This is equal to what Joe Biden said about keeping a force in the Middle East just in case, or keeping only special forces but no combat troops, which of course is an oxymoron. And again, McGovern has to keep in mind what his message was. His message was about social liberalism along with economic populism. However, Sergeant Shriver, who was from Maryland, went around the South using coded language about black people to try to win racist votes back. Both McGovern and Nixon realized that the South was lost after the passage of civil rights, but Shriver was trying to assure whites in the South that it was still a white man's land, that his ancestors were Confederate, etc. This, of course, failed horribly and didn't work. And I can't help but imagine that if news of what Sergeant Shriver was saying in the South got back to McGovern's acolytes in the North, this would not have gone over well, and it would have really depressed enthusiasm for his campaign. So yes, McGovern made some serious mistakes, and a lot of those had to do with inconsistency and backing off at key moments. Now, while Bernie has not run a perfect campaign either time for president, these are not the kind of mistakes he would make. They simply aren't. If Bernie were to win over major black leaders, and he's already won over quite a few, he wouldn't then treat them like second-class citizens. He would not pick someone like Pete Buttigieg as his running mate. So, yeah, he also would not cave in to a lot of right-wing talking points. He did cave into the Russiagate talking point, but that was because his own base believes it. So, these are not mistakes that someone like a Bernie Sanders would make. Very important to understand. Another major difference between Bernie Sanders and George McGovern is that despite the fact that both of them were more or less leftist, McGovern was much more an opportunist than Bernie Sanders. Bernie has always stood for the same stuff, regardless of whether it was popular or not. His emergence in 2016 and this cycle came from him picking positions which became popular at a later date. McGovern was a little bit more of a guy who was willing to go with the flow. So, let's look at some examples of McGovern being opportunistic, and then tell me who this sounds like. Although McGovern is well known as an anti-war guy, he did vote for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and he did so in the name of party unity heading into the 1964 election. Lyndon Johnson, the successor president to Kennedy, who was now running in his own right, wanted the party behind him on the whole Vietnam thing, so McGovern obliged his party leader with that vote. I can't imagine that's something that Bernie would do for someone like, say, Obama. After 1968, McGovern had entered the race late in 1968, basically by accident. We don't really need to go into it. And he had done a little better than he thought he might. And he also saw that Eugene McCarthy made a pretty strong run as basically just a pure anti-war guy. So after 1968, McGovern decided to double down on his anti-war stance, but moderate his voting behavior on everything else except for labor. If you look at his score from Americans for Democratic Action, which was a progressive group which tracked how progressive different candidates were, his score plummeted from 92 all the way down to 43 heading into the 1972 cycle. McGovern thought that by moderating his voting record, he would be able to attract the most votes from the Democratic coalition and from the general electorate. This is pure opportunism. And despite being the anti-war guy, As soon as McGovern announced his 1972 candidacy, he visited Lyndon Johnson and Mayor Daley of Chicago first. He visited people who were on the other side of the war issue. LBJ, of course, basically started Vietnam for all practical intents and purposes, and Mayor Richard Daley beat anti-war activists in the streets of Chicago. Then, on Mayor Daley's recommendation, McGovern endorsed many Illinois officials who also had beat protesters in various protests over the years. So basically he was willing to sell his principles down the river in order to try to win support from party bigwigs and to try to build this coalition. It didn't matter to him that most of his core were people who absolutely hated the war and always had. What I'm trying to tell you is that while George McGovern was mostly on the left, he does not have this kind of principle or consistency that Bernie Sanders has. George McGovern, if anything, was the Elizabeth Warren of his time, not the Bernie Sanders. And that is not an insult, it's just an observation. If you look at their political behavior, clearly there's a lot more in common between Warren and McGovern than between Bernie and McGovern. One crucial difference between McGovern and Bernie is how much or how little they were willing to work for the Democratic establishment and carry water for the party. Bernie Sanders has always been a registered independent. At some points, he's also called himself a socialist in terms of his party affiliation. At any rate, though, Bernie has never been a member of the party because he does not regard it as worthy. And I would argue he's right. As for George McGovern, he was always a registered Democrat. He always ran as a Democrat. And when he ran in 1972, the effect of his candidacy, whether it was intended or not, I suspect some combination, McGovern would appeal to radical social movements and then defang them and bring them into the Democratic fold. This includes both the anti-war crowd, which later produced many prominent politicians, and also the Black Panthers. These movements effectively became defanged and lost their distinctiveness over the course of the 70s. A lot of the former college radicals would then emerge as neoliberal politicians by the 80s and 90s. McGovern was so effective as a sheepdog that even after he heavily softened his stance on Vietnam and the military budget, he at first called for cutting it, then he backed off. His supporters initially gave some pushback, he gave in to them, but this didn't affect his standing with them. Today, the survivors of the 1972 campaign, at least the more liberal-minded ones, even the ones who reject a neoliberal view of 1972, still adore George McGovern and everything that he stood for. Yet, the fact is that he really didn't do as much as they think he did. They're viewing him with rose-tinted glasses. McGovern did not really fight for their movement. He got them together to get them to give him their votes. That was his fundamental purpose. And later on, they stayed within the fold of the Democratic Party because of the specter of Richard Nixon. Then they lost their distinctiveness and blended into the Borg collective that became the mainstream neoliberal Democratic Party by the time of Reagan. By contrast, Bernie Sanders, after 2016, decided first to work with Hillary to try to beat Trump, which I suppose you could call sheepdogging. Then, more importantly, he decided to build up outside political institutions to support him and his vision for the party, and then try to take over the party. The Sanders Institute and Our Revolution are not dedicated to trying to uphold democratic neoliberal orthodoxy. Clearly, they want to move the party in a different direction. Some of Bernie's other supporters have done similar things. Justice Democrats, Wolfpack, a lot of the other organizations that are also pushing for progressive goals have realized that working strictly within the confines of the Democratic Party will not get things done. There are worlds of difference between Bernie's political approach to change and McGovern's. The theory of the case is almost entirely different. The understanding of organized power is almost entirely different. So, don't mistake Bernie with McGovern when it comes to how they deal with the Democratic Party. They couldn't really be much more different if they tried. A lot of the neoliberal hack journalists who write these pieces about Bernie and McGovern being the same have a basic assumption that an insurgent candidate has to either be like McGovern, a well-intentioned but crazy leftist loony who loses by massive margins, or they have to be Trump, a right-wing demagogue who is basically Hitler. They make this broad claim which ignores the different ways in which a candidate could be an insurgent candidate. So I have to point out yet more differences between Bernie and McGovern because they don't seem to be understanding the point. Now, both Bernie and McGovern relied heavily on grassroots fundraising, and McGovern is one of the pioneers of this. This was a positive step forward. However, there are big differences in what they did, and not just because McGovern relied on mail order, whereas Bernie uses online. When we think about what McGovern was getting from his grassroots support, he was getting an average of $30 or so in 1972. If you know anything about inflation, that's a lot more than $30 today. Back in 2016, Bernie had an average donation of $27. $30 in 1972 is closer to about $100 today. So these were not necessarily small donations. These were, relatively sizable contributions. So a lot of the people who backed McGovern back then were wealthy college kids. Part of that attack was true. Bernie also has a lot of college support, but a lot of his supporters are not very well off. Unlike Bernie, McGovern was also very friendly with a number of big business executives. One of the heads of Xerox was a big McGovern supporter. This is back in the era when, famously, a lot of bank executives would put peace signs on the top of their banks because a lot of people of the professional managerial class were in fact anti-war, even if they weren't necessarily all that liberal on, say, economic policy. Some of them also supported civil rights, and good for them, but they were not necessarily friends of the working class as a whole. For McGovern, despite the fact that he had a good rating from the AFL-CIO, big business did not see him as any kind of radical, and there were actually some executives who opined that he might be less dangerous than Nixon, who was flirting with economic nationalism and tariffs in order to protect American industries. McGovern was much more interested in free trade. So you can't imagine Bernie taking up that stance, and you also can't imagine big business executives saying that Bernie would actually be fine and wouldn't actually change anything. When Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, George McGovern applauded this decision, and he said that this was the right choice. I can't really imagine Bernie Sanders saying something like that. Now, maybe he would at the time, I don't know, but this does not seem to be something that Bernie Sanders would say. And this is not to speculate on whether Ford's decision was right or wrong, merely to say that Bernie would not have approved of this. In 2007, McGovern revealed that back in 1976 he had voted for Gerald Ford over Jimmy Carter. Now, he had legitimate reasons for doing so that go beyond this pardon issue. The reason why McGovern hated Jimmy Carter is because back in 1972, Carter had tried to throw a wrench in the nominating process and make a brokered convention because Carter, then governor of Georgia, proposed a different candidate to try to steal votes away from McGovern and push the convention to a second ballot. Carter's gambit failed, but McGovern remembered. And Carter was also a member of that group of people calling him the candidate of acid amnesty and abortion. And since the two of them were fellow veterans, Carter had served on submarines and McGovern had served as a bomber pilot, I think McGovern may have felt sort of personally betrayed that a fellow veteran would throw him under the bus in this way and really just try to paint him as something that he's not. So there was some personal beef there, and this is not to critique McGovern's decision to vote against Carter. Rather, when Bernie was literally screwed over by Hillary Clinton, he still worked for her because he thought that it would be best for the country to have her as president rather than Trump. So in this case, I think I personally would be more like McGovern. However, it is worth pointing out that Bernie clearly has shown that he will do what he thinks is best for the country over his personal feelings. So there you go. That's another major difference. And in the realm of policy, one of the most interesting things about George McGovern is that his campaign almost predicted the UBI of Andrew Yang. McGovern called his policy demo grant, and the idea here was to give an annual UBI of $1,000 to each working American over the age of 18. Basic principles the same, and this was an alternative to the means testing that Nixon was proposing for a lot of social programs. This is a libertarian-esque approach, and it's something, again, which prefigures Yang. Bernie has explicitly stated that he doesn't think UBI, at least in the way that Yang wants to do it, is the right move. So, again, this is something that Bernie would not do. So to claim that Bernie and McGovern are exactly the same, and it's just a rehash of 1972, is to be uninformed about who McGovern was and what he actually stood for. McGovern is actually quite a bit different than Bernie on a whole lot of levels. So if you ignore the differences, you ignore reality. Ever since 1972, comparisons with McGovern have been used as a bludgeon to fight against candidates on the left. And one of the favorite smears that was used prior to 2008 is that a person was relying on the McGovern coalition, which was fundamentally unelectable. So the tactic would be, if someone had a coalition that was, say, college students, people of color, the LGBTQ community, and maybe some white-collar professionals thrown in, the idea is that this is not a viable coalition, and that whoever is trying to repeat the McGovern coalition was destined to fail because 1972. However, this McGovern coalition literally is the same coalition that elected Barack Obama by a healthy margin in 2008 and again in 2012. And what else did McGovern do to get elected? What else did he do to fill out his coalition with blue-collar workers? He had economic populism. He talked about the income inequality. He talked about opportunities being unequal. He talked about the political power of the rich being out of whack. He talked about wealthy people paying a lower percentage of their income as opposed to middle-class people. He talked about capital gains taxes being too favorable to the rich. Guess who else did that with great success? Barry O. Obama did this to some extent in 2008, but even more in 2012 by attacking Mitt Romney over Bain Capital and vulture capitalism. He also attacked Romney because Romney wanted to slash corporate tax rates even more. Now, Obama also campaigned on slashing corporate tax rates, but not as much as Romney wanted to. So basically, Obama was playing a populist. And a lot of the people who like to use McGovern as their only point of reference for bashing any kind of campaign to disagree with said Obama was destined to lose in 2012 because he was using economic populism that would turn people off. Obama won that election. Back in 2008, there was even a book written called, said, A Bound Man, Why We're Excited About Obama and Why He Can't Win. And part of it was about race, but the other part was just about this McGovern coalition being unviable. Guess what? Obama won. The McGovern myth has already been disproven by events, yet it has been reshaped, repackaged, and reused. The new version, of course, is that you can win with social left positions, which is one of the cores of McGovern's message, but you can't use economic populism. So that's the new version after Obama disproved the old version twice. And then Trump, who did not use the McGovern coalition but did use similar economic populism in a way, was able to win in 2016. But the only reason he was able to do it is because Hillary ran to his right. She is a firm believer in the McGovern myth, and she thought that if she used populism, it would turn off a lot of important people from the PMC. Well, she gave up her left flank on trade and a number of other economic issues, mostly trade though, and then lost. So the two big facets of McGovern's campaign strategy, at least in today's context, are both eminently viable. The McGovern coalition is clearly one of the things you have to have to win. You have to expand upon it some, but it is the core of what the party is. And an economic populist message is what you need to combat the cultural politics of the right. If you want to win over blue-collar workers who may otherwise be socially conservative, you have to give them something to vote for, and that something has to be of an economic variety. As you might imagine, between 1972 and 2020, there has been a major change in the nature of the electorate. First of all, most of the voters who were alive and voting in 1972, the majority back then were still the greatest generation, are dead. This means that only the younger crowd, say 35 and younger, who were alive in 1972 are still alive and voting today. And mostly it'd be people probably under 25 back then. So boomers and silent generation are still around, but they are starting to shrink because of age. Most of the electorate now was not alive or voting at that time. Even a good number of the boomers had not come of age yet. So things have shifted significantly, generationally speaking. This means that it's very difficult to compare social stances from 1972 and 2020 and say whether it's viable or not, because we're talking about these being tested against two very different groups of people. Second point, demographics have changed quite a bit, and this has rendered the McGovern coalition significantly more viable. These demographic changes are both racial and economic. Racially, the Latino community has grown significantly, and that is a major factor. So you can look at other demographics if you're interested, but everybody knows that the demographics of America are shifting, so not a mystery. Now, another thing that's happened economically is that white-collar voters are no longer exclusively or mainly middle class. If you think about people who work in, say, retail, they're technically white-collar workers, but they're clearly not of the managerial class. These aren't people who have two-car garages and go on nice vacations every year or two. These are people who are struggling to make ends meet. Economic populism, which might turn off a middle manager, appeals to someone who works at Target. So, again, things have changed. Economic conditions have changed. Wages have not met pace. Here's a chart which gives you a decent idea of how income used to be fairly equitably distributed, at least in terms of income gains, during the New Deal era. And we see right around 1980, right when the neoliberals take over the Democratic Party, right when corporate money starts to flow in, and right when Reagan comes into office and then starts slashing taxes for the rich and deregulates the economy, inequality explodes. And almost all of the gains then go to people who are already at the top, whereas the income of other people either declines or just stays stagnant. And this chart would be much more dramatic if it was the 99th percentile rather than the 95th. So this means that all the things McGovern talked about, inequality, the disproportionate influence of the wealthy, rich people not paying their fair share of taxes, all of these things resonate now more strongly than back then. They were already true in 1972, but now they're 10 to 100 times truer. Yeah, look, this is not rocket science. If McGovern ran today saying the same exact things and appealing to the same exact demographics, he would do much, much better than he did in 1972. It's not even a question. McGovern effectively prefigured how you need to run in today's political climate. He predicted 2020. He predicted 2016. Now, whether that was right for 1972, I don't know, but it would work today. Today it is common for people to compare a modern figure they don't like to Hitler, and they always look to superficial similarities, such as the fact that both are good speakers, or that both engage in a certain amount of murder or chicanery or whatever it might be. But when you really think about it, and you really try to understand them in their own context, understand their goals, these comparisons typically break down pretty quickly. The same is true of trying to compare Sanders and McGovern. Now, there are some similarities, both in who they appeal to and in some of the policies they stand for, but these guys have some pretty big differences, both personally and politically. This includes their stances on a lot of issues and the fact that Bernie has a movement whereas McGovern really didn't. Bernie is not an opportunist. This guy was standing up for gay rights in the 80s and 90s when this view was not popular. He ran as an open socialist in a majority Republican state of Vermont. He has never cared what other people thought of him. He does what he thinks is right, and he'll accept the consequences, be they positive or negative. McGovern, however, was a more typical politician. He was more principled than most of the people around him, but that does not make him the Bernie Sanders of the 1970s. McGovern is a little different than everyone today, in fact, because guess what? He ran for president 48 years ago. It was a different country, and he grew up in a different time and place. He was an entirely different person, the likes of which we could not generate today. He has a lot of similarities to a whole lot of Democrats today, though. You could actually make McGovern comparisons with damn near everybody in the Democratic Party. He's similar to Warren in terms of his combination of mostly lefty leanings with political opportunism. He's comparable to Yang. The demo grant was basically the UBI, just on an annual rather than a monthly basis. He's comparable to Joe Sestak. He's a veteran who has a lot of enemies in the party. He's comparable to Obama. He put together a coalition identical to the Obama coalition. And he's also similar to Hillary in the sense that he liked to use lefty social positions, and that he was not all that beloved by a lot of people who were in organized labor. So there are similarities between McGovern and literally everyone. However, there are also differences. Making the comparison does not mean much. In 2012, back when Joe Biden's brain still worked, he said something that's actually quite true. McGovern is the father of the Democratic Party. This was at McGovern's funeral. He died at the age of 90. In many ways, what McGovern did and what he stood for did prefigure decades and decades of development for the Democratic Party. They eventually returned to this form in one way or the other. We're seeing the fulfillment of the McGovern dream right now with Bernie Sanders. However, while Bernie takes up where McGovern left off, they are still very different figures. Unlike the establishment, Bernie Sanders learned from the mistakes of McGovern, and I'm at least hopeful that he will not repeat them.